A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. He refuses to have elections. He's low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished?
Donald Trump has doubled down on his criticisms of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. We will discuss the reaction to that and what it means for relationships between the US, Russia and Ukraine on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast, where we're joined by some of the BBC's other podcasters from Americast and Ukrainecast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
Hello, it's Alex in the studio.
And it's Justin in the studio.
And it's Mariana, also in the studio.
And it's Vitaly. I'm in the studio too.
Vitaly, I was very struck when you were recording the intro for Ukrainecast, and you always do the tally of the number of days since the start of the conflict, and it's 1,093, which is almost exactly 3 years. And I just wonder that the momentousness of this week, does that feel like the same level of momentousness as the actual Russian invasion in the first place?
Well, absolutely. It feels relentless and terrifying and threatening. Absolutely. I get the feeling, sometimes you could hear the wheels of history turning, literally. And what I've been hearing from Zelensky and Trump and their associates, it has the potential to change everything, not just what's happening in Ukraine, but also what's happening in Europe and across the globe. Seriously. And
a lot of the talk this week has been about peace deal imposed on Ukraine and imposed on Zelensky. But for several months, Zelensky was touting his own so-called peace plan. Was that actually a peace plan, or was that just a plan to continue? What was? I'm trying to work out whether there might be any.
It was a victory plan.
Yeah.
There's an important distinction.
Yeah.
He officially calls it a victory plan. Point 4 is calling for Ukraine's international allies to protect Ukraine's natural resources. And then, once this is over, they'll be welcome to help Ukraine exploit them and use them and benefit from them. So in a way, Volodymyr Zelensky preempted what Donald Trump is saying now. That happened back in October last year. But the difference is that there was something in it for Ukraine, i.e., okay, help us protect our resources, and then we'll work together how to use them. What is happening right now, if all these reports that we're hearing, if they are to be believed, is an attempt by America to basically tell Ukraine, look, give us all the resources, and when it comes to what you're getting in exchange, that's a lot less clear.
It's interesting. Ideas just don't come from nowhere in this conflict. Quite a lot of the time they've been floating around for a while. Right, the main theme this week, though, has been the rhetoric coming from Donald Trump aimed at Volodymyr Zelensky. And here's a supercut of Trump's speech that he gave in Florida, which includes some more quite incendiary remarks.
But think of it, a modestly successful comedian. President Zelensky talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that basically couldn't be won. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. He refuses to have elections. He's low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going.
So, Justin, what's going on here? Is this a genuine beef? Is this a pretend beef? Is this a beef that goes back quite a long way? Or is this a new beef? Or all of them?
It's all of them. And it really is annoyance, personal annoyance with Zelensky. I mean, it's as simple as that. And it can be as simple as that with Donald Trump. And that is the thing that overrides everything else, all the other things that you've just mentioned. He finds him annoying. He was annoyed that Zelensky was critical about them getting going with the talks in Saudi Arabia. He's annoyed personally with Zelensky. And he has this kind of sense. Zelensky used the word disinformation bubble, I think was the translation. I think he originally said it in Ukrainian. Disinformation, as Mariana knows well, has in the United States, and particularly with Trump people, a particular kind of animus about it because they think it is used by the left in America to criticize and attack and diminish the right. And there are examples of things that used to be called disinformation actually turning out to be true. So the use of that word also needled Donald Trump. Having said that, he's capable of completely forgetting about it, the day afterwards. And I do think, and this is a point that Boris Johnson and others have made, which I think has some sense to it, that actually you shouldn't take it too seriously, because look at Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. I mean, he used to call him Little Marco. He used to regard him as a complete idiot. He's now his Secretary of State. He can change, and he might change with Zelensky, but at the moment he finds it annoying. He finds him annoying, and that's important.
I suppose the issue with that, though, is if it is just rhetoric, but people do respond to rhetoric. I mean, Emmanuel Macron held a summit in Paris this week with other leaders because of what Trump had said. And then there's also the point that if you're rewriting history about how the war started, well, then you will think of the war differently.
Oh, well, that's very important. So there's one thing, which is the argument with Zelensky. There's another thing, which is what's actually happening here. And as Vitaly was saying, what's actually happening here is hugely important and hugely momentous and a very, very big change. Donald Trump does not. I was talking to an American former diplomat the other day who was saying the big thing about Trump, that you've got to get straight right at the beginning. He regards the United States not as a shining city on the hill, not as a set of ideals, which I think is the kind of way we've all of us grown up thinking in the United States, and they themselves have thought of them that. He thinks it's a geographical territory and it's a powerful nation, and that is all that it is. It's important, but that's all that it is. And all of this flows from that new way of thinking about America itself.
And Mariana, just that word disinformation, it's just quite weird. That, I mean, there's nothing more real world and visceral than a war. But yet this one's turning out to be quite online.
Totally. And I think that it's so interesting thinking about the choice of that word. And then I can think more broadly, the kind of information battle that goes on versus what's happening on the ground. And when you think about the comments that Zelensky made, I think that he was quite specifically referring to something that Russia is well known for, which is a kind of propaganda disinformation playbook, disinformation being the deliberate spreading of stuff that's not true. And he was referring to polling. So this suggestion that Donald Trump made that his approval ratings are really, really low, something like 4%, although we're not sure exactly what Donald Trump was citing when he said that. He then pointed to other polling that suggests otherwise. And, there are some indications that perhaps he isn't as popular as he was before, but not nearly as low as Donald Trump suggested. So he was kind of talking about something specific, but then the wider context of, hang on, what Russia does is it says quite brazen things about me or Ukraine, and it uses these attack lines, and his view that Donald Trump is just repeating some of those same attack lines, which if you look at it, Donald Trump is. Like some of the things that Russia says, Donald Trump is then just saying himself. But the difference is that word disinformation in a wider context has been totally sort of turbocharged. And in the American context, it's kind of one of those culture war-y type words. And it's almost like the kind of culture war lens is being applied to a war. And that's where the kind of fusion between the online and the offline world becomes all a bit complicated, because it's almost like people are arguing about like ideals and freedom of expression and all of these other values, for example, that they have. Like, is America more aligned with Russia in terms of its values right now than it is with Europe? But actually this war is about real people on the ground who are being killed and whose homes and lives have been destroyed.
Let's hear a little bit of Zelensky reacting to all of this week.
Since we are talking about 4%, we have seen this disinformation. We understand that it is coming from Russia. We understand and we have evidence that these numbers are being discussed between America and Russia. It is unfortunate that President Trump, and with great respect for him as the leader of the American people who constantly support us, unfortunately lives in this disinformation space.
So Vitaly, two things. This now famous 4% number, which Trump says is Zelensky's approval ratings. What can we actually say about the Ukrainian public's views of Zelensky? And the second thing, where actually are we on elections in Ukraine? Because they're suspended because of the war, but are they suspended forever?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. There's a law in Ukraine passed 10 years ago, 2015, and it's called Law on Martial Law, which is slightly clumsy, but that's what it is. And it says there that as long as there's martial law in Ukraine, you can't hold presidential elections, you can't hold parliamentary or local elections. And that's a law that was passed, well before the full-scale invasion started. So to say that Zelensky doesn't want to hold elections, maybe he doesn't, but there's also a law that's 10 years old that says, no, you can't. And coincidentally or not, the loudest voices that are calling for this election to be held are coming from Russia for years and years and years, and America. And within Ukraine, even the people who might be considered as Volodymyr Zelensky's potential rivals, key rivals, they're saying, look, now's not the time. For two reasons. A, how do you hold an election if you're being bombed, if you've lost 20% of your territory and millions of your citizens are refugees? And secondly, and this is something that the previous president, Petro Poroshenko, has been saying, okay, I don't really like Zelensky. He's been sanctioned by Zelensky's government recently, but he says, look, there's only one man who will win that election, and his name is Vladimir Putin. Now, in terms of how popular Zelensky is, there are still credible opinion pollsters in Ukraine. They're still doing their job, publishing their surveys, and they suggest that Volodymyr Zelensky's approval rating in Ukraine is higher than Donald Trump's ratings in America, more than 50%, 52, 57, thereabouts. So a lot of what Donald Trump has been saying recently, I would say it's kind of factually challenged, and there's no other way of putting it. There are facts and there are opinions. You can argue that, how good Zelensky is as a comedian, as Trump says he's modestly successful. Yeah, maybe.
Bit of a language barrier.
But when it
Actually,
comes,
is he funny in Ukrainian?
it's a matter of taste. But some of his jokes,
He was hugely successful, wasn't he?
yes, some of his jokes are not safe for work. I'll put it this
Okay.
way. I'll leave it to our viewers and listeners to do a bit of Googling or YouTubing, but it's a matter of taste.
And Alex, talking about language, I've noticed a common theme amongst kind of like the senior British politicians who've reacted to what Trump's been saying in the last 48 hours, and that they criticise his facts, they criticise the choice of language, but they don't necessarily criticise him personally.
I'd even pull back from that a bit and say what they're doing is contradicting Donald Trump's position. So very clearly asserting their support for Ukraine, as they have done throughout, but on a very personal level in some cases for President Zelensky, in direct contradiction of the message and tone we've heard from Donald Trump, but they are absolutely stopping short of criticising the US president. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. I mean, I was speaking to somebody, in the Foreign Office today who was saying that the UK government's position hasn't shifted as a consequence of what's happened over the past few days and what we've seen from President Trump and President Zelensky. And that is because, they are aware of how Donald Trump can operate. And what they are looking at is the slightly longer term and this idea that they call it a bridge, that the UK can somehow carve out a position because they're no longer a member of the EU. And we know exactly, as Justin said, what the view of Trump and some of Trump's followers is of the EU. They think he might have a different perception of the UK. So can they carve out this position where they can be some sort of bridge between the EU and the US? And most importantly, what they don't want to do is lose any kind of seat at the table any more than they fear they might already have done when it comes to whatever happens in negotiations in the next few weeks and months. So they are being incredibly cautious about the way they respond to this. But it is worth saying that there was definitely a feeling that following President Trump's comments about President Zelensky, there had to be a response. They weren't going to just let that go. And so you had these very carefully crafted 3 lines of diplomatic language, which made it absolutely clear that the UK was standing full square behind Ukraine without any criticism of Donald Trump.
And all throughout Thursday morning, people were waiting for Nigel Farage to actually say something, leader of Reform UK. And then late morning, he finally did.
It turned into one of these slightly strange things where we all know that Nigel Farage is an ally of Donald Trump. We all know that Nigel Farage has been, in some areas, a bit of a cheerleader of Donald Trump. And so there were a lot of people saying, well, hang on, now what? Let us know what you think about Donald Trump now in light of these comments about President Zelensky. And so Nigel Farage did. He did an interview with GB News, and he also gave a speech at a conference in Washington. But the key thing about this was his interview with GB News, which he chose to speak to.
A friendly outlet to him.
Exactly. And he did say he did not think that President Zelensky was a dictator. He did say very squarely that it was Putin that invaded Ukraine and nothing else. He did, though, say that he did think that Ukraine needed to set out a path to elections. So definitely a more nuanced position from Nigel Farage than we've heard from Kemi Badenoch or from Keir Starmer or very much from Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who's taking a much stronger line. But what is quite interesting when you look at this is that I do think very broadly, I mean, there are some differences between the parties. Ed Davey is trying to carve himself out as somebody who's prepared to stand up and challenge Donald Trump and consequently challenge the other political parties to do the same. But very broadly, and I've spoken to several people about this, I think there is a bit of a political consensus in the UK about the approach that needs to be taken, which is repeatedly asserting your support for Ukraine without completely alienating Donald Trump. And I think that is the position that really all of the main parties are taking right now.
Right, Americast cousins, we've had an email from one of our listeners, Sue. She says, I listen to Newscast every day. No mention of Americast. I mean, I'm sure this will turn Sue onto your podcast.
No longer allies.
And she says, the past few days, I keep wondering, have all the Democrats left the United States? Why aren't leading Democrats like Obama, Clinton and Pelosi and others shouting from the rooftops that Trump is lying through his teeth and is only spouting Putin propaganda?
Interesting one. All the ones that Sue mentions are kind of retired or semi-retired, which is interesting enough, isn't it? It kind of answers the question that actually...
Although they're not retired when they don't want to be.
Well, yeah, they're doing series for Netflix and stuff, I suppose, but, they're retired from the fray. Nancy Pelosi is still in Congress, but, I mean, she's no longer got a leadership position. Look, it's not just the Democrats. It always happens when a new president takes over, particularly when they're quite energetic, and I think we can all agree that Trump has been quite energetic. The other party just goes to bits for a bit, and they have gone to bits, frankly. They're just not, there isn't a coherence about their approach to Donald Trump. They don't quite know, in a sense that it mirrors what journalists find difficult with Trump, that there's so much stuff that what the heck do you concentrate on? Do you just pull out one or two things and miss a whole lot? Or do you just do a kind of blunderbuss approach to everything and then risk losing the important stuff? And the Democrats have got caught up in the same thing. And there just isn't. Sue's right. There isn't really a Democratic effort to stop Trump. What, in a sense, is more interesting, there isn't a Republican one either. So you've got key people on Capitol Hill who are obviously really nervous about what he's doing. A lot of senators going into the Senate being doorstepped and holding their mobile phones, pretending to talk to people, to important calls, unable to answer the question, what do you think? Do you think that Zelensky's a dictator? Do you think that we should do X, Y, and Z, including really senior people? John Thune, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, saying we need to give the president some space. I think I may have slightly misquoted him, but that's the kind of gist. So basically, even he refusing to say, and he would be someone who's quite a moderate on this, in other words, someone who would believe that Ukraine ought to be defended, even he's not willing to go out on a limb. So no one, not Democrats and not key Republicans, is going out on a limb and opposing Donald Trump at the moment.
It is interesting, though, because if you look at, particularly to your point, Justin, there have been so many things over the past month that some Democrats could choose to post about. So, for example, the war in Gaza and some of the comments that Donald Trump has made, or other issues around the government departments and the changes that Doge, Elon Musk's department, are making and all that kinds of stuff. And there are a few who have gone out on who've been very strong on social media, put out a statement. The problem is it kind of goes into their own echo chamber and it's just lots of people who agree with them. But this attack line of Donald Trump likes Vladimir Putin and has a connection to him in some way is one that the Democrats have really gone for in the past. And so in some ways it's kind of something that falls on their lap. They're like, well, great, this is what we've said for ages. But I just think
it didn't work for ages.
Well, exactly. But as in for them, it's kind of like an easy win, I guess they'd think. But actually, again, there's just not quite that, like Justin says, that kind of energy around it in the same way. And same with the Republicans as well, that when you analyse the language of the kinds of things even that they're kind of posting, it's so careful, exactly like you were saying, Alex, with UK politicians, not to kind of criticise Donald Trump, but to express support for Ukraine or to oppose Vladimir Putin.
Right, let's talk about process. Vitaly, what's your understanding about what shape, timeline, any negotiations about Ukraine's future are going to have? Because it looked because last week when we were recording Newscast, and we were all sat around here going, oh, these things take ages, and then sort of 3 days later, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, was sat around a massive table in Riyadh, and it looked like the wheels were hitting the road?
Okay, the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is that I don't think anybody else has a good idea because, when it comes to negotiations, when you listen to the negotiating parties, i.e. America and Russia, they're sort of saying the same thing. No NATO for Ukraine, no chance of reclaiming territories captured by Russia. This war cannot be won by Ukraine. Zelensky is a dictator. So you've got to wonder how they sort of negotiating. What are they negotiating about? Because it's any sort of deal suggests, okay, I give you something, you give me something. But what I've been hearing so far is a list, and I've got a list actually of the things that Russian TV's been saying for years about Ukraine, and I was like, tick, 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 this is Donald Trump, some sort of ticking them off. So I've got the impression that he's sort of giving all these things to Russia. Maybe it's a plan, like a clever ploy, which will lead to a deal that will have something for Ukraine. But so far, and I've got to be honest, it's really difficult how Ukraine can benefit from any of it. Okay, people are saying peace is good, people stop dying, and that's a good result in itself. But from that point of view, that's what Vladimir Putin demanded on day one of his special military operation in February 2022. It sounded a bit like a gangster movie when he said, look, put down your weapons and nobody gets killed. So I think to suggest that that peace is good enough for everyone, it brings us back to square one. This is what Russia wanted. A huge chunk of Ukraine, control over Ukraine, its security arrangements, and nobody gets killed.
So interesting, just on the timing, it's worth saying that, although the UK government's very keen to say it supports the idea about a US-led negotiated peace, what they're also saying is right now we're having talks about talks. We are nowhere near a negotiated peace settlement. And I think, exactly to the point that Vitaly is saying, the gap here between Russia and Ukraine is as big as it ever has been.
And Vitaly, just to go back to the process, Keith Kellogg, who is Trump's envoy for Ukraine, was in Kyiv today speaking to Zelensky, and they were meant to do a press conference, and we were ready to do an episode of Newscast around the press conference, and then the press conference got pulled at the last minute, and we were trying to work out, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And then, first of all, is it a good thing that Kellogg is speaking to Zelensky at all? Because that suggests Ukraine's not being totally frozen out of this.
Well, there's also the question of how much influence Keith Kellogg wields at this stage, because the messages coming from all these envoys and officials around Trump, they're so contradictory. First, we heard from Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, that NATO membership out of the question, reclaiming territory out of the question. Now, J.D. Vance is saying that nothing is off the table, which to me suggests that all these people are looking up to the big man, the boss. Yeah. He's the one who decides.
And that's partly, Vitaly, because there are a lot of people who aren't in post. It takes a long time for an American administration to come into being,
because there's thousands and thousands of jobs.
But actually, there are some key ones. For instance, the Undersecretary of Defense, who's in charge of policy, is not yet in position. So there are all sorts of lacunae in American government that will play into this fact that I think you've identified exactly correctly, which is that Trump himself is enormously powerful at the moment because the counterbalances to him institutionally just aren't there.
So I have severe doubts about whether Keith Kellogg can go back to Donald Trump and change his mind in any degree of measure whatsoever. I think in terms of process, what everybody's waiting for is for Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to assemble their teams of negotiators and get things moving into whatever direction they decide. And neither Zelensky nor Keith Kellogg, I don't think they have much influence on it.
And lacunae, for people who don't have a thesaurus to hand, is a posh word for holes or gaps. Right, Alex, not to obsess about process, but we've just actually, as we've been recording, we've got some more details of the next week's process and who's going to Washington when.
Yeah. Shall I check my phone for said details? No, you're right.
Well, so, of course,
there has been a lot made about the fact, quite rightly and understandably, that Keir Starmer was heading out to Washington to meet President Trump, and with the view to the fact there was a sort of emergency summit organised by Macron of European leaders earlier in this week. the message coming out of that was there was potentially quite a lot riding on that meeting between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. Now we are hearing that Macron himself is also going out to the White House, and he's going before Keir Starmer. So the latest is that Macron's going out on Monday and that Keir Starmer will be there on Thursday. And I think what is interesting about this is, for all the reasons that we said before, there is definitely a cautious approach. And I think they are still seeing, that, particularly the UK, seeing itself as potentially in a position to persuade, if not influence, at least have a conversation with President Trump as all of this unfolds. But there is also a sense that Europe and the UK have got some work to do themselves on the kind of message that they go with. You know, there is a broad acceptance now. And to Justin's point in the beginning, this comes as no surprise, the message that's come from the White House about the fact that Europe needs to step up when it comes to security and defence spending, because it was an argument he made in his first term, particularly when it came to NATO members. And it is an argument that he's just reiterated now. There has been an acceptance across Europe and from NATO that does need to happen. But what there isn't is a firm plan or commitment as to how. And I think that there is a bit of a sense that before Emmanuel Macron and before Keir Starmer head out to Washington, they're going to have to go with a pretty clear position to put to Trump to be able to catch his ear.
And we should say the conversations in Whitehall about what kind of military force would be deployed as a security guarantee, like those conversations are really happening. It's not just Keir Starmer writing a newspaper article saying there might be some troops one day.
No, they actually are happening. But then how interesting that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, when Keir Starmer floated this idea about having some sort of peacekeeping or security force, immediately Olaf Scholz was like, hang on, it's a bit irritating that you're discussing that at that point, which just shows how difficult it is to get unity from Europe among some of this stuff. And that's before we even touch upon what that would look like. Would they be NATO-backed? And if they were NATO-backed, would that mean that the US would step in, as and when needed under Article 5 of the NATO treaty? And that's before we even get to spending, defence spending and actual capability.
And actually, behind the scenes, the Americans don't think the Brits, even the Brits, who are the kind of preeminent nation when it comes to the ability to project any kind of force at all, they don't think the Brits would be up to it. They don't think behind the scenes that our army would be capable of providing any more than, I think, 5,000 or so.
Well, hence presumably why Starmer talks about the need for US backstop, because that's also kind of flattering the US.
Completely. And also, just to confirm that, it's not just the President Trump view, but we've had senior military and ex-military figures in the UK make exactly that argument, that at the moment capability is a real issue.
Yeah. And also, that's before we even consider the question of what happens if Russia says no. And Russia has said no. They said, no, we don't want any troops from NATO member countries under whatever flag. We objected it strongly. Does that mean it's off the table?
Well, it's the old Brexit lesson of we spent so much time focusing on the negotiations within people on the same side that we then maybe forget about the negotiations with the people on the other side of the table.
Vitaly's point is really important there, because the Russians are saying, absolutely no way are we going to allow this to happen. So I actually asked Lisa Nandy, who we were interviewing earlier on, so what happens at the culture secretary? She said, it's way too early to get into this. Well, you kind of brought it up as an idea. So... and that would be a really important side of it. So there is, a lacuna, as you would put it, singular, between what they're talking about and what might actually happen.
Well, thanks to you all for being here in the Newscast studio.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it's also your studio too.
We call it the worldwide headquarters.
Oh, okay. Of course you do. Yeah, the worldwide headquarters of Americast.
Not that we're Trumpian, anyway.
The best headquarters of any podcast in the world. Yeah, and thank you to you too for listening to this mashup of Newscast, Americast, and Ukrainecast in a big week for all our podcasts, because there's been a lot of news and it's been incredibly significant. So thank you for listening to us. Bye.